welcome to the fourth and final chapter in part 1 of character creation in Blender, the Rhino. My name is David Radford, and in this chapter we're mostly going to be going over adding his ears and accessories such as his bull ring, belts, and loincloth, but we're also going to be touching on dynamic topology optimization as well. So now that we've got the majority of the character sculpted, we're going to kind of finish him off. First things first, he doesn't have any ears at this point, so I'm going to bring in a cube and apply my matte cap material to it. Delete those two vertices off the corner. And here, because his ear is going to be equal thickness, I'm just going to kind of rough in the shape using only single polygons, and then use the solidify modifier to give it that little bit of thickness. I don't want to worry about having to try to sculpt, make sure that it's going to be the right thickness. So there I am adding solidify, adjusting the thickness of it, and then I'm going to add a subsurf modifier as well. Just adjusting the size and rotation and making sure that it's in the right place. There I've added a mirror modifier. I think that's just about right. Just doing a little bit more tweaking here. His ears are actually kind of a fun little shape with that little whip back at the top. So there we are, and then I'm going to apply both the mirror modifier, the solidify, and subsurf. And then here I'm going to boolean the ears onto the rest of the body the exact same way that I did it with the hands. So in this case, I could have saved myself a little bit of time by changing the Boolean operation type to union before I selected the ears, but oh well. Little pro tip for you. If you know what Boolean operation you're going to need, set that before you select your object that you're going to Boolean with. It'll save you a little bit of time in calculations, especially if you're working with a really heavy object, like a character sculpt or something. So then just applying that modifier, and then going to delete the original geometry here. Going back into sculpt mode, enable dynamic topology, and then I'm going to optimize just to make it so that it'll run a little bit faster. And then here I'm just smoothing in where the geometry was created. I'm going to do a little bit more cleanup. You'll notice that at this point in the sculpting process I do have smooth shading turned on as opposed to flat shaded. That's because I know that when I bake my normal maps in the next section of the tutorial, I'll be needing to bake it from a smooth shade, so I can see exactly how much detail is or is not in the model at this point. Really tightening up those creases and giving that last bit of definition that's really needed to make certain parts of the model pop out. So here I'm using the crease brush inverted. And then I'm going to add a little bit of texture to this by using the polish brush and going vertically along the horn, kind of giving it some growth striations of sorts, and then just flattening out the top a little bit where it was supposedly cut off. So now I've got the mouth in sort of a decent shape. I'm going to go ahead and add in his teeth, or tooth rather. The tooth itself I'm not going to be doing any sculpting on. This is just traditional polymodeling. Just adding an edge ring in there. I'm just going to model it into the shape that I want. So here I'm going to be modifying the lips to fit around the tooth. So I want to just make sure that the tooth is where I want it to be, and then I'm going to change the outside geometry around it. Use the grab brush and just pull that section of the lip out. Switching back to the standard brush, and I switched my curve back to a smooth fall off. So here I'm just trying to give it a look of as though the tooth was pushing the lip out. In the concept art, on the lip itself you can't actually really see any definition of the lip being pushed out. It's not shaded that way. But I'm trying to think, in real life, if a tooth was pushing that far out of a character's mouth, it would definitely be obviously pushing the lip out as well. So, trying to get that nice definition and nice form that implies that there's actually some flesh there in the lips that's being displaced by the tooth. And then doing a little bit of the same with the top lip as well. Kind of making the front of his lips a little bit thicker. And then here, I was looking at the concept and noticing that he's got that little pucker in his top lip. Wanted to give that some nice shape to it. Here, this step isn't really necessary, but it was something that I decided that I wanted to do. This is a way that you can optimize a dynamic topology sculpt, is if you enable collapse short edges and then turn your strength all the way down to 0, when you brush over the model, it's not going to deform it at all, but it is going to reduce that geometry. So anywhere that you've sculpted that you have a lot of geometry, that you don't really need that much to create the definition that you want, you can brush back over it and reduce those details. Like this section in the lip right there, being able to reduce that level of detail, especially if you're going to be using the model for anything significant, or if your computer is just getting overburdened, you can do this to optimize your model. Yeah, so like I said, overall this is kind of an unnecessary step, but I decided I wanted to go through and get the topology a little bit more even. Get rid of some wasted geometry. So this is an area, if you do decide to go through and optimize your model like this, you're going to be changing your detail size a lot depending on how much detail you want to get rid of. So by doing that little bit of optimization, I was able to reduce the overall poly count on the model by almost 100,000 tries. Here I'm creating the bull ring. It's going to be in his nose. So just kind of getting it roughly in place, and then I'm going to make sure that the nose fits around it correctly. So there we go. Now here we're going to be adding his clothes. For his belts, all I'm going to be doing is using a shrink wrap modifier to get the geometry to stick to him, and then I'll be using solidify as well on this, just like I did with the ears. So there I've added the shrink wrap, and I've set it to project, and I've also enabled negative for direction. Enabling X mirror allows me to move things on both sides of it instead of having to use a mirror modifier. Sometimes it's nice to just actually have the geometry use symmetry. So there I've duplicated the mesh and moved it down. So there's both of his belts. In this series, I'm not going to go into detail on creating any sort of buckles for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's not in the concept, and I didn't really feel like designing a belt on that front. But also, I kind of like the look of it without a belt. So there I add a couple of edge loops so that once it's subsurfed, it'll have some definition around the edge. There we are. Here I'm enabling X mirror, and there's areas of the belt that are getting sucked in a little bit too close to the model. So kind of pulling those out. Any divots would actually be spanned by the belt as opposed to it sticking to the character too closely. I mean, this guy's not shrink wrapped. So there I did actually split the model in half and use a mirror modifier briefly. So in that sequence what I did is I duplicated the geometry for the bottom belt and then deleted everything except for one row of edges and then extruded it down, added some segments into that. This is what's going to actually become the loincloth. Just select a handful of faces and split those off. And then here I'm triangulating everything so I can give it a little bit more accurate shape. And then I'm going to use the mirror modifier again to get it to the other side. Selecting all the top ones, creating a weight map. So this is going to be the pinning for the cloth simulation that I'm going to run to give it those nice wrinkles. So I've enabled pinning and selected it. So initially I'm not going to get anything that I want because it's already hanging perfectly straight down with nothing to fold. So I've selected the bottom vertices, and using proportional editing, I'm just pushing it out so that it'll create some extra cloth, as it were. Pushing it out even further. And this is all just trial and error. So when you're working with something like this, you aren't necessarily going to know exactly what it looks like until you just try it. So here I'm trying out some different presets with leather, rubber, trying to get something that I like. Obviously, the more wrinkles you want, the more you need to push the geometry out at the bottom. I was trying to use proportional editing, but it wasn't exactly doing what I wanted to. So here we are. I'm just scrubbing through the frames to decide exactly which frame I want to capture. And then pressing Alt-C will enable you to convert from a mesh to a mesh, and it will basically apply the cloth sim. And I'm just using proportional editing to kind of push geometry up a little bit higher. And then there's a couple of other small things that I have to change as well. And I decided to use the sculpting tools for this. So when I ran the cloth sim, it didn't take into account that it was hanging over this character. So ended up needing to use a little bit of sculpting to come through and push it out far enough. Deleting a couple extra vertices. And then just doing small tweaks. You could just hand sculpt all of these cloth folds. I decided I wanted to go with a cloth sim just to do something a little bit different, have something a little bit more accurate, more realistic. So here I'm adding a solidify modifier to give it a little bit of thickness. And then make sure you check even thickness. That will make sure that you don't end up with any sort of weird distortions. I'm adding one edge ring, or edge loop rather, around the width of it. And then I decided to test out remesh to give it the right thickness. And then I ended up detriangulating it with Alt-J. Remesh wasn't giving me the look that I wanted. But so here we go. We've got our final Rhino model. Got all the sculpting done. He's got a little bit of clothing. Looks like he's ready to go on to the next stage. Thank you for watching. I hope you were able to learn a lot from this series. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to write me an email or hit me up on Twitter. In part 2, I'll be going over various retopology techniques, so keep your eyes open for that series coming up soon.